Hello, and welcome to something I haven't done in a very long time. More than 5 years, I think. God, I hope it's been more than 5 years. Anyway, you're just looking at a table right now. I am the social solipsist, and this is a Rants and Raves video, I guess, because technically it's unscripted. I'll get to the chase. When I started my series on Westerado, I mentioned that I just bought a new controller, and it was requested that I give my take on game controllers. This is a very, you can see me waving my hands around in the shadows. Sorry about this. I'm doing this with my phone, and it's going to be one of my most unprofessional videos. Anyway, at least it's on a tripod. Um, uh, anyway, what was I saying? I got a new controller, and I want to give my take on controllers because it's a very personal thing. Probably no one cares, but I like thinking about it. Anyway, where do we start? That I could start one of two places. I guess we'll start with this guy. This is the Xbox 360 controller, classic Xbox 360 controller with the wireless with the battery pack. This is the one that I've used forever, for PC gaming at least. It's classic. It's run forever. It's basically a heavily modified Xbox, original Xbox controller, and we're not going to delve into the history of the Duke and all that. I'm not here for video game history. This is for my personal experience. So go watch somebody else's channel for that kind of stuff. Check out Stop Skeletons from Fighting if you really want a good history of weird video game stuff. Anyway, this has been my main PC gaming controller for the longest time. I don't play with a controller a ton, but there are some games that sort of expect you to have one or just generally play better with it. Normally I'm mouse and keyboard as much as possible, but I'm also somebody who really likes the analog stick for movement. I think it continues to be an utter shame that we don't have more hybrid control schemes available to PC gamers. The fact that we're still using four-way or combined eight-way movement for and with no analog control for movement on PC games is a disaster. There have been a couple of small attempts by some startups to get PC gamers to use half controllers or those sorts of things. But for the most part, most games don't even support a mixed control scheme. With some exceptions, usually incidentally, but then of course there's things like flight sims and those sorts of things, which tend to take whatever input you want, no matter what. So this has been my daily driver for, well, not daily driver, you know what I mean, for at least a decade, I think. I probably got it in 2010, 2011. The one part of it I'm not showing you right now is the dongle that comes with it. It is very much a product of its age. It's wireless, but it does not use Bluetooth or any other, universal wireless technology. It has a USB dongle that you have to plug into it. It also has a port on the top that you can plug it in for USB, but it's a non-standard port. Obviously, this is originally so it could connect to the Xbox, but the Xbox itself, the 360 itself uses USB ports, so why it's like that, I don't know. We're not going to go down that rabbit hole. Anyway, this has some problems, but it's been my longest time use for a reason, and that's basically because of the profile. Now, I don't have huge hands or tiny hands. I have kind of medium-sized hands, but to me, this has always felt like in my hands to be the right size. I also tend to prefer the offset joystick layout. To be perfectly honest, as much as I've thought about it, I can't tell you why. Because what I basically grew up on was this. This is the PS3 DualShock 3. So the PS3 has an interesting history. I guess it still has the branding on it, doesn't it? PlayStation in general has a weird history with its controllers. The original, this is heavily unmodified from the original PlayStation controller. The very first PlayStation controller was basically this, but with a cable and without joysticks. Then, partway through the PS1 era, they added the joysticks to it, and it was basically this with a cable. And then they basically continued using the exact same controller. In fact, I think they're totally backwards and forwards compatible between PS1 and PS2. There may be some difference in the analog control. One of these two buttons on the PS1 and PS2 era used to be analog, and that was to turn on and off the analog control, whether it would read it as an analog or digital input. But it was also software specific, so if the particular game, this is, I could be slightly wrong on this. As I recall, depending on the game, the analog button might do nothing, or it might have a drastic effect on how the game plays, because it could be locked such that it was either 1 or 0, right? 0 being the neutral space. Well, actually, when you're doing controller mapping, it's 1, 0, -1, or some variation thereof. But I digress. Anyway, the in-between space is what accounts for the analog aspect, whereas, of course, the D-pad is a on or off for any combination. Well, any two. You can't do both side to side. And that gets into a problem I have with D-pads in general, just being that, they can't go both directions at once. And there's very few occasions when you would actually want that, obviously, but there are a few games or a few input styles, especially on PC, where there's like unusual usages for controllers, where not being able to put in unusual inputs, or not being able to put them in fast enough, even if the controller, the chips on the controller can't process the input fast enough, especially for things like fighting games, it gets pretty messy. But I digress. Like I said, this is basically unmodified from the PS1, PS2 era, with the exception of it is now Bluetooth. In place of the cable that it used to have, it now has a mini USB. There were also two versions of the PS3 controller. The original, I believe, I may get this screwed up. I believe the original was called the 6-axis. Or, no. I'm going to get it backwards because I didn't look this up. I didn't do the research because this is totally off the cuff and I'm trying not to make a huge thing out of this. But there were two versions. There was the DualShock 3 and then there was the 6-axis. And the 6-axis included motion control. So you see the 6-axis branding. You can sort of see it. The lighting's terrible. 6-axis branding there. That included the motion controls that they were trying heavily to encourage people to adopt as their new gimmick. Especially at the same time as the Wii was coming out and they were trying to go, we have motion control too. We have the motion eye tracker and all that garbage. Anyway, there's a whole history there that I didn't go into, but there were multiple versions. My main problem with this is that, well, there's a couple. Mainly it's its ergonomics. Like I said, I tend to prefer the offset joysticks, but that's a matter of personal preference. However, the ergonomics of the thing are very much not for adult-sized hands. You can see how little material there is for me to grasp onto on the back here. It needs probably another some amount to really fit nicely in the hand, the same way that the 360 controller does. And these two being from the same era, obviously the Duke was too big for kids' hands, but this sort of goes the other way, where by the time I had access to a PS3, I was a full-fledged adult, and having all this loose, no controller there, really does not make this the nicest thing to grip for an extended period. At the same time, because of the fact that they basically left it unchanged, it feels very light in the hand and kind of chintzy compared to the 360 controller. I don't know how much they actually weigh in difference. When I'm holding them side by side, they don't feel drastically different. But some about the plastic of this one, I suspect they probably continue to use more or less the same molds, the same plastic type, and I mean, the rumble motors in it don't seem to have any weight to them. This, by comparison, seems to have a good heft. It feels nice and balanced in the hand, whereas this feels, well, at least when I initially got it, my feeling was always this feels off. And maybe it was because I was so used to, so many years of having this heavy cord that would drag from the front on the PS2 era. But this always felt odd to me and continues to this day. It also doesn't do anything different with the analog sticks, with the buttons. They're still squishy membrane buttons. They don't have it's very hard to tell, especially as they wear in, whether you're actually actuating the button or not. And it's not the biggest deal in the world, but it's, if you want to know that your input went how it was supposed to, that's the biggest thing. Actually, as I'm holding this, I'm remembering one more thing that they did actually change from the one thing they did change substantially between the two, and that is the triggers. So let me jump back to the 360 for a second. The 360's triggers are pretty great. They were definitely the best in the era. They are very much they're a gun style of trigger, and that's probably in no small part due to the target audience that they were aiming for. They were aiming for a more mature audience than the Sony PlayStation people, who were really aiming at more family friendly in general. However, between the PS2 and the PS3, the triggers changed. Not super well, I guess they are it is pretty substantial. So the PS2 buttons, the PS2 bumpers and triggers were basically the same as each other, that is. So rather than a rocking motion like this has, it would just actuate straight in like this one. And that was fine for the era. It was never really a big problem. But with all the developments that have happened in the years since, it's since become a little bit disappointing. These are better, but again, they feel very squishy. Like, you don't really get... They seem... I'm sure they don't use a very advanced mechanism. So, because of how springs work, and I'm not going to give a physics lecture right now, but because of how the springs work, they get harder to press the further you get in. And by here, you're like, well, have I actuated it all the way or not? And frankly, I couldn't tell you at what point it actually actuates, which is a shame, because by comparison, the triggers on the PS or the 360, and I locked the white balance, but it's not quite working. These have a very linear pull, even though they are, rotating around an axis. They the actuation force along the trigger is basically it's basically the same all the way through, which is really nice. And you get a very well, this comes to whoops, I'm gonna accidentally turn my consoles on. This comes to a very squishy stop. It never bottoms out unless you really squeeze on it. This comes to a very distinct stop. I'm not sure if that's going to come through in the audio, but there it is. The other main difference between these two controllers for the era was the battery. As you can see, the 360 used AA's. I just have them with rechargeables in it. It also had a built-in battery pack and recharging system that you could buy as a separate add-on. I don't recall whether these two were priced differently when you would buy them off the shelf. I think they were priced about the same. Frankly, this wins out dramatically in the battery area for a couple of reasons. One is you can replace the battery. Now, yes, it does have this bulbous pack on the back, but that never gets in the way of your hands when you're using it. It's all out of the way, unless you like to, flap your fingers around on the back for some reason while you're playing. It's never a problem. So having the option to switch to alkaline batteries, to switch to rechargeable AA's, or to have rechargeable packs with a dock and all that stuff. Option is king. The options are going to win out. That's really the end of it. This controller, as lightweight as it is, has a tiny little battery in it. And now you can't really compare them to each other directly, just by virtue of they don't use the same voltage, they don't use the same amperage, they don't consume the same amount of power when they're on, they don't use the same kind of wireless technology, so having this be Bluetooth is a clear advantage for it. So it's apples and oranges to compare them, but this doesn't last that long. I don't know that I've ever sat for a whole sitting and worn one out, but also I got this not with a PS3, but with a PS Vita. And even playing extended periods on that, I don't want to. I can't remember if I ever wore it down all the way, but this was also the era of smart controllers and the console telling you when to plug it in. So come to think of it, I think I definitely have. Just off the top of my head, I want to say it's somewhere around like a 6-hour battery life, whereas these can go forever, and it's a snap, like 30 seconds to replace the batteries if you have to. Versus this, which is a pain in the ass to have a cable long enough, or even if you wanted to go as crazy as having an external battery pack, like plugging it in to get it working again and having no other options, and not even really being replaceable or repairable, is always gonna be a ding in my book. So anyway, this video is already going on way too long, and I have way more controllers to talk about. So buckle up. Why don't we... let's talk about the PS3 compared to the... Well, actually, one more thing with these before we go on, because this is going to be relevant to all of them. The main reason I replaced this was... One, it's 10 years of use, it's wearing out. You can probably see some of the plastic debris under the joystick there, which is just from grinding this around for years and years and years. The D-pad buttons are extraordinarily squishy. They always were, but they're getting worse. And it's wearing out. I mean, anytime, to steal someone else's reference, where the 200-pound monkey hits the load is where it's going to wear out. Any user interactable component is eventually going to wear, and how durable you make it versus just how long the life of the device is expected to be is, it's always a question. And 10 years is probably more than they expected me to put on this thing. So, credit where it's due. However, one thing I'm going to complain about on this and all of the other controllers, I believe, is these joysticks. Because this is the first thing that really started to wear out. As you can see, they've been worn pretty shiny. And they're not supposed to be like that. In fact, if I remember correctly, when you originally got it, it had bumps on at least one of the joysticks had bumps on the 4 points, on the compass rose points. And that's clearly been worn away just by use. However, what's even worse than just wearing out on that is that these get sticky. I'm not going to get into a chemistry lesson here, but almost all soft plastics, which is what this is not rubber. Um, all soft plastics, uh, most of them are styrene and butylene types. They have styrene and butylene molecules on the ends of the chemical compositions, and those degrade, especially in presence of oil, and that includes oil off of people's hands. So you'll see this all over the place in all kinds of plastics that you have to interact with, including like kitchen utensils and like power tools and all these sorts of things. They fall apart. And in particular, I remember that after going off to college and coming back and like having not used it for years, touching my PS2 controllers, um, feeling the joystick knobs, even this one's, I've only had this 5 years and no less. I've had this, I've had this a shorter amount of time than one I'm going to show you, an old callback. And this is already feeling a little bit sticky. These knobs get sticky, and you can't just wipe off the stickiness because it's literally the plastic chemically degrading. And basically, my feeling on that is whenever possible, avoid rubberized plastics, so to speak. Quote unquote rubberized. There's no rubber in it. This is also true of mice. I usually wear out mice either by breaking, eventually, just click so much you wear out one of the buttons and it gets stuck open or stuck closed or something like that. The other problem I've had is that the plastics on them degrade, and they've got all these quote unquote soft touch plastics, but they fall apart after a couple of years. It's just how it works. It's bad chemistry, and they should stop doing it. Anyway, moving on. PS4 controller, a drastic improvement. Now, I'm actually going to put the 360 controller back so you can compare them. As you can see, well, let's get this out of the way for a second. As you can see, suddenly they listened to me and there's a whole bunch more material here. They simplified the profile. They added the touchpad for better or for worse, move the buttons around. It's a pretty substantial change. I think this is a fantastic controller, one of the best out there. It has very little rubberized plastic, except for on these two joysticks here. Everywhere else has been improved in some way or another. The buttons feel much better, much less squishy than these. I don't really know the reason why that is. It may just be the material or the design of the underlying. It's still a membrane button, I'm sure, but the design of the membrane gives a much clearer like clickiness to it, whereas these always feel very squishy. I would say, actually, I had forgotten that these buttons are also quite nice and clicky compared to these, which are very squishy. So this improves a lot of things. Makes the whole thing feel better in the hand. You see, it fits into the hand much more nicely. I mean, it only took them, boy, was it 10 years? I think it was 10 years basically from between this controller and the PS1 controller. And, you know, listen, guys, you can make more changes than a little change to the triggers prior to that. But anyway, this is, next generation Bluetooth. It's got better integration for peripherals. It's got a built-in headset. It's got a built-in mic or a built-in speaker. I don't think it has a built-in mic. It's got the light bar, which was not really used very well, but it's a neat thing to have on there. It clearly doesn't seem to add too much to the bill of materials, since these were, well, I want to say these were both $39.99 US when they were being sold directly on store shelves. This might be more expensive, actually. I'm not sure. Obviously, a different profile to the triggers and to the bumper. It's still a pretty squishy, wobbly bumper, but it's got a more distinct click to it. Same with the trigger. They've started to use the same sort of like more linear actuation force with a pretty clear, end of travel. So they learned a lot from the 360. Yeah, generally all around quite a good controller. The problem, of course, was I don't want to delve too much into history, but the compatibility for PC use was always pretty questionable. Um, it basically required you run like third-party software because Windows still, or Microsoft still had a death grip on the the Windows space, and was integrating their X input. The X input system is part of DirectX, which is a Microsoft proprietary product. And even though the direct input stuff that this is basically using can easily be cross-read, it was never officially supported because Microsoft wanted Sony to keep out of their space. And by their space, I mean the PC space that they would continue to neglect for, well, in total about 20 years before, making an attempt. But yeah, generally a very good controller, probably one of the best for a while. However, I never really held a an Xbox One controller until fairly recently. It was just not a device. I didn't feel like I needed to replace the 360 controller because the one I liked, one with the hand profile that I liked, was still going strong. No reason to replace it. No reason to make it any more complicated than it needed to be. Actually, I'm going to go back and talk about the 360 one more time. That dongle is a problem for a couple of reasons. But the main one is it had a very common death state, which is there was a fuse in it that would almost universally blow after a couple of years of use. I had a friend who was willing to crack the thing open and do the micro soldering required to bypass it and make it work again. But yeah, not being Bluetooth was one of the worst things the 360 controller had going for it. Now, between these two controllers, I believe the version of Bluetooth being used changed substantially, including the adoption of Bluetooth Low Energy, which also meant that this could consume less power while in idle state or even while in use, and generally would be better. This has a much nicer hand feel to it than this, and not just for the ergonomics reason. It also has more weight. It feels more balanced in the hand, much more like the 360 controller, but it's still stuck with that unreplaceable battery that you just have to recharge, this time via micro USB. So, on the whole, a drastic improvement, but not perfect. Not my favorite by any means, but certainly one of the, a worthy improvement for the generations as they passed. So I'm going to take a sidestep for a moment and bring back an old friend from the last time. The last time I made a live action video many years ago. Y'all remember this? I am not ashamed to say that I bought an Ouya with two controllers. Now, I didn't watch my old Ouya video back before doing this, so I don't even remember. I think I noticed it during that video. I ordered one with it came with one controller. I ordered it with an extra controller, and one of them was bad, and they sent me another one, which I believe has the same problem. And what's the problem is these horrible bumpers. I'm just going to be real quiet for a second. You can hear how crunchy those are. So this is actually the best of the three controllers, I think. These buttons are fine. This is the worst D-pad in the world. I refuse to let anybody tell me otherwise. These joysticks are fine, although I actually do prefer the 360 style of concave versus the PS3's convex. This sort of has an in between where it has a ridge on the edge, even though it's technically convex. Yeah, these are the worst because they're almost flat and they've got that soft touch plastic on the top. This is not a great controller. It's a pretty bad controller. But it does have a few things going for it. One, I believe it was $15. So under the circumstances, $15, pretty all right. It even has a touchpad on the top. It's not great. It's not a very good touchpad, but it is a touchpad. So I was able to use that to control like a mouse on various things. And the fact that it's Bluetooth means it's compatible with pretty much everything. The one other thing that I really like about it, you'll notice, well, it doesn't look like it has a battery pack anywhere in it. If you saw my original video, you'll know this already, but batteries are under the faceplate. This is a brilliant design. Admittedly, it means no rumble, but, you know, if you just want to make something that fits the batteries in a compact fashion, this is a great way to do it. It means it doesn't get in the way in the back. You don't have to, you can keep the sleek profile if you really want to. It's pretty good. These faceplates, these screw holes in the faceplate, which are used to assemble the plastic to the metal, also fit into these holes here, which have little magnets at the bottom of it. Obviously, the intention was to have lots of removable faceplates so you could easily customize your controller. In reality, as we all know, the Ouya didn't go anywhere, so it didn't really get wide adoption. But hey, it's a cool idea, and they affix nicely. They're not squishy. It's a good idea in general. But I wanna remind everybody that the Ouya exists. It wasn't great, but it wasn't it wasn't the shit show everybody thought it was either. Anyway, we're gonna move on from that and forget about the Ouya. Not forever. We'll come back to it one day. And we're gonna talk about my new controller. So like I said, I never had an Xbox One. I never felt the need to replace the 360 controller. And the main reason I didn't do that is just, like I said, I like the profile of this. And having not held one of these and not had any friends really who had Xbox Ones, I didn't want to switch without feeling it in my hand and knowing if it was what I was going to like. This is not an Xbox One controller. However, it is very similar to one. This is the, as far as I can tell, brand new design for the Xbox Series S and the Xbox Series X, which, as I will continue to say, for their entire lifetime and into infinity, is the absolute worst possible name for a console ever. You morons. What is it, the Xbox Series? And then the designation is S or X? Why couldn't you just do numbers? Or why couldn't you at least use, the Xbox One should have been called the Xbox Scorpio. And then this one should have been called a similar, whatever, cool guy name. You know, it doesn't matter. Just don't call it the Xbox Series, because Series is it's like calling it the Xbox Mark. You don't call it the Mark, because then it's Mark 1, Mark 2, Mark 3. It's a designation. Anyway, it's really frustrating and I hate it, and I want somebody to be ashamed for it, because they should be. Fuck, this video is getting really long. This is the new controller. They call it the Xbox Core controller because somebody in the design division there has some semblance of sense. Now, the question will be whether that will all be undone the next time they upgrade the controllers. If they don't call the next one the Core 2, that will be a huge mistake. However, I like this a lot. I really like this. It makes some nice changes, including the D-pad is no longer a It's actually the first one I know of where the D-pad is no longer a membrane. It's I forget what the button type is called. These are individual buttons. They are not membranes. They will not wear out. Usually these types of buttons are rated to like 500,000 clicks minimum, sometimes upwards of 5 million. They are meant for longevity. The joysticks are pretty good. They're nothing special, not really to write home about. I do like that the textured edge around the side of it, which is going to be hard to pick out here, but the textured edge around the side of it adds a nice additional level of grippiness, depending on the type of controller user you are. I am somebody who tends to drag by one edge. So if that's your thing, that's a very welcome change. I also like the kind of clean, limited, limited extra design stuff. The 360 is very much a design emblematic of the age in which it came out. Still colorful buttons, still these offset gray and white. All these buttons stick out. The Xbox logo is still chromed and green and it glows. It's an antiquated visual design. This, by comparison, is much cleaner, and that's not for me to say that I always like minimalistic stuff, but I think it should be. I think for things you interact with all the time, the the function always needs to come before the form, and having this button which lights up, this turns on the controller and off. These buttons that are, I also like the type of this sort of detent, this concave sort of place to sit your finger instead of on top here, which just doesn't seem as. The whole D-pad's bad, but this is actually probably my favorite D-pad ever that I've had to handle, especially if you are, playing something that uses, diagonals frequently. Not that I really have, but just having the clear clickiness of it and it just feels nice. It's basically what I'm trying to say. They've slimmed down the buttons. You're going to have a really hard time seeing this. The buttons are not as bulbous on this as they are on here. They are a tiny bit smaller and a tiny bit more bulbous on this. This feels very much like you can just lay your finger on top of it. They're not completely flat like the PlayStation controller continues to be. They're sort of a nice middle ground. Obviously, they've updated these buttons to go with the new functions they wanted to use in the Xbox Series S and X. I don't really care one way or another, as long as they still operate as expected on PC. And the fact that this is Bluetooth leaps and bounds, of course. The native support is also obviously quite good, although Microsoft's very forced integration with all of their services is hard to escape and can be pretty irritating when you just want to use a controller and it starts opening programs you've never seen before. But I won't get into that too much. Admittedly, the PS4 controller support has been getting better in recent years, in a native way. But yeah, pretty great controller. A couple of other things that I like about it: the triggers have been redesigned. The triggers and the bumpers. The bumpers still use that clicky same. It's the same kind of clicky button that was used here, and the same kind of clicky button that was, or more or less the same kind of clicky button that was used in the bumpers in the 360. So that's been updated there. Which, they feel nice where they are. I don't know that they have the same sort of reach in terms of like if you're like me, I know some people hold their controllers like this, and I think those people are insane. I have always held them like this, and you reach up for your bumper when you need it. So I don't know if it's just a matter of practice of like, I don't think it is. I think, well, it's some of both, but the ergonomics of this tell me I could always hit the bumper and still have my finger on the trigger without really moving it. This feels less so. However, one of the great improvements is the size of the trigger. Because it now covers this whole area rather than being like offset into it, you can pull down on it at any point and it feels very comfortable to do. So that's really, really appealing to me. They also, instead of coming to a full clicky stop, they still have a nice clear end to their pull, but the backup stopped, account storage full. Okay, I'm just gonna hope the video is still rolling. These come to a nice firm stop, but they are clearly hitting a rubber bumper inside of it or something like that. So they're not as loud. It's just kind of nice. This also avoids using very much of that plasticized or that soft touch rubber, except on here, which frankly I think they could do away with the soft rubber on here. We've got the technology these days to make this same kind of thing with all the same definition and none of the need for the soft touch rubber. They avoid putting any on here, which was a trend. I forgot about this. I don't know. I don't think that the backing on the PS4 controller is soft. It feels a little soft, but I think that's just the light texturing they've added to it. I don't actually know. I would suspect I should open these up or at least look up what type of plastic they use for each of these. Because that has a lot of effect on how it feels in the hand. Anyway, this manages to avoid it, adds some nice texturing here that was not there on the 360 controller. Again, has the more modern modular headphone microphone jack. This is a proprietary connector, which I'm not the fondest of, but hey, it's there. And it uses USB-C, which, for better or for worse, is the way into the future and is a better connector. I think it's pretty inarguable that it's a better connector than mini USB or micro USB ever was, at least for peripheral devices like this. The other thing you may have noticed is the lack of the bulbous part on the back, and that is because, although it is a little hard to do, getting the backing off to get at your batteries again. So once again, using double A's this time, I don't think is there even a specialized charging? Let's see. Oh yeah, there is, right on the inside there. There's a 4-pin charger controller. So you can buy the native battery pack, which I think is quite expensive actually. I think it's like $40. Or you can just buy, a rechargeable AA type replacement. Again, I'm just using AA's. One thing I don't really like, I actually don't like this in all kinds of electronics. Because AA's have a negative and a positive end that are not the same, they're not both flat. It's not like an 18650 where both sides are flat. Normally what I expect to see is there's a springy end and a flat end, right? And the springy end goes on this and the flat end goes on this. And so when they are asymmetrical like this, my instinct is to put them both the same direction, but that's clearly wrong. So unfortunately, on this, you actually do have to look and see the detail of whether it's positive or negative, which is not my favorite thing, but I'll live with it. But they click firmly in there. It's the same kind of thing. Avoids all the problems of having an integrated lithium ion that's hard to swap out or hard to repair or hard to charge. I think this is one of the best controllers out there right now. However, and I know this is already a 45-minute video because holy shit, my feet are starting to hurt because I've been standing for so long. I have one more controller to talk about. This is the Xbox One Pro controller version 1. As far as I'm aware, this is not my controller. I borrowed, this is a $150 controller. I was loaned it with an Xbox One X from a coworker who agreed to let me borrow it so that I could play a game that I haven't been able to play because it's Xbox only and I don't have an Xbox. Anyway, he loaned me this because it's just what he had. He now has the version 2, which I think is still over a year old now even. This is the version 1 as far as I'm aware, and it's pretty great, but it has some problems. Let me start out by saying this is not worth $150. Anyone who tells you otherwise is kind of nuts. This is more in keeping with the design of the Xbox One controller. Obviously with this bezel and all that, that's what the Xbox One controller was like. It's still a lot of the same thing. You can sort of see some of the echoes of the 360 controller and some of where it would end up with the Xbox Core controller. You've got the improved triggers, you've got the improved bumpers, you've got the same sort of flat things here. I'm not actually sure whether this is the controller that pioneered those features that would then end up in this one, or if that was always the case for the Xbox One controller. If somebody can tell me that in the comments, that would be great. What I do like about, there's a couple of things I do like about this and a couple of things I don't, but it's definitely not worth $150, and there's some core design flaws that I'll show you why that I think that's the case. So the first one is the whole thing is covered in soft touch plastic. This is all soft touch plastic. It's that velvety type that's, you can barely tell it's soft, but it's just a little bit squidgy. And then on the sides, this is that rubbery plastic. The whole thing, with the exception of this silvery part, is soft touch plastic, and I really do not like that at all. Admittedly, maybe they've improved it enough that, you know, it's not such a big deal, but frankly, for $150, I don't want to pay $150 for a controller at all. But for $150, I should be able to use it for 10 years and have it never wear out. In those 10 years, that is. And there are some things that will lead it down that direction. So for one, this here and the joystick material, well, part of the joystick material in there are metal. That gives it some extra weight, for better or for worse. But it's not going to wear out in the same way. I mean, I was showing you how this is starting to, you can see that white plastic dust, and I can feel it crunching because I'm wearing out the edge of the plastic here. That's not going to happen here because it's a smooth metal surface. Or at least I would assume it wouldn't. I would assume they've done more testing on these. Obviously, the difference in testing a controller and, you know, things like mice and keyboards and all that has dramatically changed in 10, 15, 20 years. So I assume they test all of these things much more than they did when some of their predecessors came out. The other thing you may have seen just a peek of is the bumpers on the back. This is really cool. When I first saw this come out, I was so tempted just by virtue of, hey, it figured out how to put more buttons on the controller, which is a constant problem for people who want to use controllers for some things, but may need, you know, more inputs. Having bumpers on the back is a great idea. However, having now used this is absolutely the wrong way to do it. These are terrible. When I first picked this up, look where your hands are. Now, I'm not going to say that everybody holds the controller the same way, but the way I hold the controller is I grip it with these fingers. That means you're clicking these all the time. And that's no good. Um, it means accidental button presses. It's just awful. Thankfully, they were smart enough to design this such that one, you can remove them. They're just locked in with like a pivot pin that locks into this slot, and then they actuate a button underneath. So you can remove all of these. No tools required, no nothing. Um, but that doesn't change you could design your own levers that lived somewhere else. But fundamentally, I think this is a huge mistake. Having them elevated out of the body is not the right way to do it. The way to do it is to have recessed buttons in here where you can sort of feel where they are, and they're concave, so your fingers sort of sit in them. But unless you're actively like pressing on them on an individual finger basis, you won't press them. This is a mistake. Maybe this is only me. Maybe this is just how I hold controllers and how I use controllers, and for lots of people this isn't a problem. But for me, this seems like a big problem. They are, I want to say they are they've got to be magnetically affixed. And that gets into something else that I also really like about this, which is you can disassemble this, at least partially. You can remove the joysticks. So if this was the only part of the thing that was that soft touch plastic, like this one is smart, instead of this whole thing, then if these ever wear out, you can just replace them. Or you can, if you don't like this design, if you want something with more texture, less texture, if you want it concave, convex, they're super easy to replace. I think, based on no knowledge whatsoever and not having looked it up, I don't think they're aluminum. I think they are probably a zinc alloy, maybe a zinc nickel aluminum alloy, actually. Might be something like Zamac, for anybody who's in the know on materials. But these are light, easy to replace, and they are fixed with magnets. They don't screw on, none of that garbage. I have never had a problem with this, admittedly in limited testing, but like you're only going off not even to a 45-degree angle. There's no way this is going to ever come off unless you drop it or intentionally remove it. This likewise is affixed by battery. It's by magnet. It's just a simple cast item. He sent me his controller with the additional bits that he has. It comes with additional joysticks and a different D-pad with a different layout. But again, if you don't particularly like this like dish style, there's a regular D-pad, and you could conceivably 3D print your own. Having this be modular, I think, is a great idea. And admittedly, while it certainly adds to the bill of materials cost, hard to complain about it. Anyway, not worth $150. Uh-oh. Video max file size. Well, let me stop real quick. Well, I apologize for what I'm sure is going to be a very jarring cut. This is the problem with trying to film. Anyway, video cut out, and I apologize for that. I was getting towards the end of my thoughts on this anyway. I'm basically done thinking about this. It's a good idea. It's too expensive. It's got some good design choices, but a lot of design flaws as well. Not $150 worthy, but there's things to be learned from this. I actually do not know what the difference is between the Pro Controller 1 and Pro Controller 2 are. Again, if anybody knows anything about that, pass that along in the comments as well. Anyway, Yeah, so that basically covers the lineup of my controllers. Obviously, I've talked about my history with some other controllers as well. I've also used, various third-party controllers over the years, Mad Cats and all those sorts of things. I think everybody did at some point. Oh, this autofocus is not working great. Um, so, they're fine. But in general, I'm really pleased with this thing. I think it's a great successor to all the things that came before it. It's a lot of things streamlined, a lot of things improved. It's built down to a price, and that's a good place to be. Um, I think normally it's $60. I got it for 40. It was on sale, like basically with the release of the Xbox Series. It was $39.99, and I grabbed it, and I'm happy I did, because if I didn't, then this would inevitably die on me at some point, and then I would be sad and feel a little more frustration towards um, Microsoft screwing me for another controller. Anyway, I don't know if that I don't really have a conclusion for this video. It's gone on far too long. I thought it would be 15, 20 minutes. Here we are, almost an hour, possibly more than an hour. I hope it's not. Anyway, if you've sat here through this entire thing, I'm not sure why you would, but thanks. Let me know your thoughts on various controllers in the comments. Obviously, there's a whole lot of them that I have not touched on, mostly because I don't have a particular lot of experience with the ones I didn't talk about. But I also have opinions on some of those as well. So you can put your bad opinions in the comments, and then I'll tell you you're wrong or something. I don't know. At this point, I'm just being belligerent because this has gone on too long. Thank you guys for watching another random episode of this channel. I've been the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.